Okay, so this is a lecture on Aristotle's From Rhetoric. It's in our Reading the World textbook, begins on page 177. I want us to look at the introduction that's written by the author first. In the introduction on page 177, the author distinguishes between what Aristotle focused on as compared to what Plato focused on while teaching. It mentions in the middle that unlike Plato, whose writings focused on the mind and the world of ideal forms, which is something I'm constantly talking about in class, right? Platonic ideals. Aristotle focused on the tangible realities of the external world. Also, while Plato's arguments tended to be prescriptive or to advocate positions and points of view, Aristotle's writings were mostly descriptive, which meant that he was describing and organizing and classifying subjects. The rhetoric, on the other hand, concerns the practice of rhetoric. And this is something that I introduced to you last class, which is the difference between the dialectic, which is how we come to the truth, or different ways to getting to the truth, and the whole job and process of coming to the truth. And when we talk about truth, we're talking about absolute truth, not relative truth, the truth of the world, the way that the Socrates and Plato described the ideals, absolute. And the rhetoric is the way that we teach truth. So they really go hand in hand. And I have a diagram I'll show you maybe on the lecture, maybe in class, that came to me while I was reading the text. Let's see if I can bring it up here. This is my diagram that I wrote in the margins, which as far as like how I saw these two things in relationship to each other, or when is the dialect is how we come to the truth, and rhetoric is the teaching of the truth. And though one is not more important than the other, I think that we see that as scholars and as students that one of our main jobs is, what is the truth? Look from every different perspective. As I've been teaching you, truth doesn't come in just one form. It comes in a lot of forms, and we have to examine the whole perspective and look at ideas and concepts and problems, not as two-dimensional or even three-dimensional, but multi-dimensional, and try to see all different perspectives of ways to view that problem. And then we start to come to truth. That's one part of the process of academia, right? And of studying. And the second part is teaching it. Because once you discover the truth and you have that eureka moment and you're like, oh my gosh, I figured it out. What good is it if it dies with you? Now you have to teach it. And teaching it is crucial because you have to be able to not only convey the information adequately and accurately, but you also have to teach it in a way that is memorable and engaging, right? And so when I was doing the last two classes and we talked about the Eumenides and Pericles' funeral oration, and I was describing to you the kinds of argument that those two speakers were using, one being Athena in talking to the Furies in the Eumenides, and how she flattered them, how she appealed to their authority, but also reminded them of her authority, and how she reiterated her arguments, and how she saw them slowly wane in their stubbornness and in their fight against her. And repetition was a useful tool there, right? Where she kind of repeated her counterpoints to them and reiterated them so that they were, remember I told you how when people repeat things, the more we hear it, the more we believe it's true. And so that's what Athena was doing. And then in Pericles' funeral oration, which is this annual festival where he has everybody coming together and reminding the people of what patriotism really is, and the honorable dead, the soldiers that died for their country, and how they really have a legacy that lives on forever. And what he's really doing in that speech is persuading citizens to give up their life for the state. And that's probably one of the hardest things that we persuade people to do in history, right? Is sacrifice anything, especially your life. I mean, so you really have to pitch a sale there to really get people to sacrifice. So in Aristotle's Rhetoric, he talks about this dynamic relationship between, and steady, dynamic, but also very steady. I mean, it changes as the culture changes, but it is consistently this relationship of two things. The rhetoric is the need to teach truth, and the dialectic is finding out what is true. So let's begin at the top of page 178. Section 1, 2, both sections are covered. Rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic, he writes. Both alike are concerned with such things as come more or less with the general ken of all men. And ken is something maybe should be in your dictionary. Remember to keep writing in your dictionaries those new words that you come across when you read. It's not something that you glance over. We don't do like the whole SAT thing where like, oh, what in context could it mean? No, we're students. So look up the word, write the definition. Ken means one's range of knowledge or sight. So what he's saying is both alike, the dialectic and the rhetoric, are concerned with such things as come with the general knowledge and sight of all men and belong to no definite science. Accordingly, all men make use more or less of both. Okay, so he's saying we all do this. We all have a way of finding out what is true. We all have a dialectic process, and we all have a rhetoric that we use when we try to convince people of what we know, of what is true. Parents have it, friends have it, we have it in our relationships, we have it in our jobs, right? We're not maybe particularly aware of the methods and techniques that we're using to convince and persuade people. We are certainly using things and probably very attuned to the differences between when you're trying to persuade someone face to face or persuade someone in an interface like now where we can't engage with each other. You're kind of just receiving this message or on paper, right? Where it's not an image attached to it at all. It's all written out in black and white and very two-dimensional and really up to your imagination to kind of conceive of what is happening persuasively inside of you. For to a certain extent, all men attempt to discuss statements and to maintain them, to defend themselves and to attack others. So right there, he kind of gives you how we all use the dialectic and the rhetoric. We all attempt to discuss statements and maintain them. So we're all trying to find truth. Truth is stable, it is fixed. Okay, that's why it's true, right? And that's why we're always looking for truth. To defend themselves and to attack others. So now that's the rhetoric side of it, right? Where we have to defend what we believe, and sometimes we have to attack what others believe if they're wrong, right? Ordinary people do this either at random or through practice and from acquired habit. Both ways being possible, the subject can plainly be handled systematically, for it is possible to inquire the reason why some speakers succeed through practice and others spontaneously. And everyone will at once agree that such an inquiry is the function of an art. So he's saying two things here. Number one, it is possible to inquire the reason why some speakers succeed through practice and others spontaneously. So I think we all maybe know someone who's a great storyteller or someone who could really be very persuasive, is really skillful in talking or selling things, right? And it just comes naturally. And that's what he's saying. Rhetoric is a talent. Some people have it as a talent, but it's also an art. Okay? An art can be practiced and honed. Your craft can constantly be getting better. You can start with nothing and learn a craft and an art and become great at it, right? And other people just come to an art and just can play, right? So he's saying both are possible with rhetoric, and that's kind of a good thing for us, right? Because it's kind of saying we can use our intuition and whatever thing we feel is compelling us to convince. But at the same time, we can also, if we're not very skilled at it, or skilled at oration or speaking or convincing people, or we get our mind boggled with things, then we can also practice it. It can be something like a plan that we follow. Why is it important for students? Well, very important for students because in your writing, you're constantly making arguments, right? And then in the entire paper, you're defending your arguments. So on one hand, you're saying, this is what is the truth. And then the second hand, and I'm going to tell you why. And so one is your dialectic, the conclusion of what you found to be true. And the second is, here is how I'm going to show you that it is true, right? Remember, Athena didn't even hide how she wanted to persuade. She said, let me persuade you away from your anger. And so it was very clear up front. Other times, we don't want to say that so bluntly, right? Other times we're saying, oh, well, we'll just kind of like appease people or placate people or kind of beat around the bush with a topic and try to get people to see a different point of view through a story maybe. But that is depending on the situation, of course. And we talked about that last class. And everyone will at once agree that such an inquiry is the function of an art. Okay, so it is an art, rhetoric. I mean, that's really fascinating, where I think that we can look at dialectic as a kind of science, like where we, like detectives, look at the scene, we collect the evidence, we put the pieces together, and we can say, what does it mean? Okay, and what is the bigger picture of this? And does it apply to other things, right? Deductive reasoning. And then the rhetoric is the art. It's like any different way. And I bet you if you had, 10 professors teach you this exact same text, we would all have a very different way of doing it. We would all focus on different points in the argument. We would all focus on different points of our argument to you. And some may be more convincing than others, or they may all be equally convincing, or they may all be not equally convincing and not convincing at all, period. And so that just shows you there's many different ways. Just like there's lots of ways to get at the truth, there's a lot of ways to discover dialectic. There's also a lot of ways to practice rhetoric. So let's go to the second paragraph now. In this, he says the modes of persuasion are the only true constituents of the art. Everything else is merely accessory. These writers, however, say nothing about enthymemes, which are the substance of rhetorical persuasion, but deal mainly with non-essentials. And that's something I'll speak about in class, because I'll point you to a different part of the book that talks about that more specifically. The arousing of prejudice, pity, anger, and similar emotions has nothing to do with essential facts, but is merely a personal appeal to the man who is judging the case. Okay, so he's talking about one type of argument style, which is pathos, okay, appeals to emotion, where he's saying prejudice, pity, anger, and similar emotions have nothing to do with essential facts, but is merely a personal appeal to a man judging a case. So you can persuade people based on emotions. We see that all the time. We see it in politics, we see it in relationships, we see it in parenting all the time, right? Consequently, if the rules for trials, which are now laid down in some states, especially in well-governed states, were applied everywhere, such people would have nothing to say. And he's saying that because laws are, just like we have different laws for every state that we live in, right? And even different local laws for every community we live in within that state. He's saying, so sometimes you can't use the law to convince, because the law varies and the law is not consistent every place you go. However, humans are consistent. We're fairly consistent everywhere we go. We all have the same needs. We all get hungry, we all get thirsty, we all get tired. We all want love, we all want affection, we all want glory, honor, right? These kinds of things that are similar. We all want goods, material things, comfort, security, these kinds of things. He says, so appealing to that may be a little bit more successful, right, than to appeal to the law, like say as a lawyer does in a very specific courtroom. He has to create points of law that are his argument, and he abides by those. He certainly uses other forms of rhetoric, such as pathos, right, to appeal to emotion, especially if it's a jury trial. But his job primarily is to convince based on the law, okay? So that's the differentiation that Aristotle is making there. Further down, he builds on that example, and he says, again, a litigant has clearly nothing to do but to show the alleged fact is so or not so, that it has or has not happened. Sometimes we're just trying to convince people of a very specific fact. I was there or I wasn't there, right? As to whether a thing is important or unimportant, just or unjust, the judge must surely refuse to take his instructions from litigants. He decides for himself all such points as the lawgiver has not already defined for him. Now he's going to give us a little bit of further discussion in paragraph 3. It is a great moment that well-drawn laws should themselves define all points they possibly can and leave as few as maybe to the decision of the judges. And so now he talks about the creation of law and how we create the law so that there is no wiggle room. Okay, we're trying to create such specific and definitive laws that when someone breaks it, it's so easy to show in front of a judge or a jury. And it's saying, look, he broke the law, like a speeding ticket, right? That's very clear. That's numbers. So when you go over the number, you broke the law. However, there are other laws that we leave a little bit more wiggle room, right? But we still try to keep them fixed. And that's where lawyers kind of use rhetoric to kind of talk around that space, okay, or in through that space. So, he says, this is why we make the laws very specific. First, to find one man or a few men who are sensible persons and capable of legislating and administering justice is easier than to find a large number. Next, laws are made after long consideration. I mean, anybody who's gone to law school or studies political science knows that legislation takes a long time. I mean, even when we're looking on the news for something as recent as these gun laws that we want passed, right? Or healthcare laws or immigration laws. These things take time. There's a lot of discussion around them. So before a matter becomes law, all the ideas of the dialectic and the rhetoric are in place in order to create a law. Okay, so he's saying that the law is there to keep us safe and stable, and it's been well thought out. On the top of page 179, he writes, whereas this is the bottom of 178, whereas decisions in the courts are given at short notice, which makes it hard for those who try the case to satisfy the claims of justice and expediency. The weightiest reason of all is that the decision of the lawgiver is not particular, but prospective and general. Whereas members of the assembly and jury find it their duty to decide on definite cases brought before them. So the lawmaker is creating laws for the populace, okay? Not specific cases, like when you go to court. And the reason why we go to court is when there are very specific issues that need to be delved into more deeply because certain situations create different scenarios and then have different outcomes. And so we need to explore that more when we go into a courtroom. And that's where he says that members of the assembly or jury find it their duty to decide on definite cases brought before them. They will often have allowed themselves to be so much influenced by feelings of friendship or hatred or self-interest that they lose any clear vision of the truth and have their judgment obscured by considerations of personal pleasure or pain. Saying, this is why we have laws. This is why we don't bring everything to court and decide every single thing, okay? We have laws to keep stability and consistency because people are emotional, okay? And he's saying that. He's saying when you go to a court, you are appealing emotionally to people, 100%. In general, then, the judge should, we say, be allowed to decide as few things as possible, okay? Bottom of that paragraph, the only question with which these writers here deal is how to put the judge into a given frame of mind. So this is kind of when you go to a place, any kind of event, whether it be a business event or a religious event, even a wedding, right? When someone gets up to make a speech, the first thing he does is crack a joke or make you laugh or kind of like, and we call it an icebreaker, right? There's a reason for that. And it's exactly what Aristotle is talking about here. With the comedian or the speech maker is doing right before he gets up and gives you a speech, right? That could be very serious even. He wants to turn your face from this to this, right? He wants to kind of get you ready to receive whatever he's saying. He wants to create a feeling of lightness, okay? Not a heaviness, a feeling like it's okay. Let's have fun with this. Let's receive the message. It's exactly what he's saying here. This rhetoric, okay, the writers on rhetoric are dealing with how to put the judge in a given frame of mind, okay? How I'm going to convince the judge of my perspective. About the orator's proper modes of persuasion, they have nothing to tell us. Nothing, that is, about how to gain skill in enthymemes, which are theses, okay, or arguments, okay, that are built. Next paragraph. So he's definitely making a decision, number one. First, it's a very different kind of persuasion you make when you're trying to persuade one person. Secondly, it's a very different kind of persuasion when you're trying to persuade a group, okay? This is exactly what I showed you in the last class between Athena, who was trying to convince the Furies, who identify themselves, even though they're a group of Furies, they identify themselves as one, okay, even in their own pronoun, I, versus Pericles, who was addressing everybody in Athens at one time, okay? And I was saying how Athena's argument style was very different from Pericles' argument style. And this is exactly what Aristotle is going to get into. In the middle of this paragraph 4, he writes, political oratory is less given to unscrupulous practices than forensic because it treats of wider issues. In a political debate, the man who is forming a judgment is making a decision about his own vital interests. There is no need, therefore, to prove anything except that the facts are what the supporter of a measure maintains they are. Okay, so sometimes you just want to present facts, okay, and proof of facts, and that's convincing enough, right? He talks about emotional appeal, right, appealing to people's prejudice, pity, anger, sympathy, rage, stuff like that. And then there's just logic, right? Which is the logos, appeals to logic and reason, where it's just facts. Like, look, guys, this is the facts. I mean, the facts speak for themselves, right? And so the whole persuasion is this statistic, this story, this testimony, this first person perspective, all of that, right? Let's go to paragraph 5. It is clear then that rhetorical study in its strict sense is concerned with the modes of persuasion, right? Different methods, modes, ways of persuasion. Persuasion is clearly a sort of demonstration, since we are most fully persuaded when we consider a thing to have been demonstrated. This is kind of like the way that we just like images, the way that we like people are different learners, right? Some people have great memory. Some people can remember words on a board. Some people remember images more. Some people can remember sound more. So he's saying that demonstration, which is like kind of all of the senses, right, is a key to when people feel fully persuaded, according to his words. The orator's demonstration is an enthymeme, which in Aristotle's term was the basic unit of an argument, a conclusion attached to a single supporting premise with other premises merely implied. It's kind of like a rough equivalent of a thesis statement, which you are very well versed in now, right? Because you have to make your thesis statement at the beginning of all the essays and then convince me that it's true, right? In a political debate, the man who is forming a judgment is making a decision about his own vital interest. There is no need, therefore, to prove anything except facts. Okay, let's go down to the paragraph where I was. The orator's demonstration is an enthymeme, and this is in general the most effective of the modes of persuasion. So Aristotle is saying, create a statement boldly in the beginning. Say, this is what I'm going to convince you of. Then repeat it again, right? I mean, that's kind of my advice as a speaker. Support it, continue it, and then repeat it. And this is when the audience realizes it's true. At the bottom of 5, it says, it follows plainly, therefore, that he who is best able to see how and from what elements a syllogism is produced will also be best skilled in the enthymeme when he has further learnt what its subject matter is and in what respect it differs from the syllogism of strict logic. Let's go to paragraph, that first big paragraph where he literally enumerates a lot of things. So we have to go through this. Rhetoric is useful, number 1. Okay, now he's trying to say why it's useful, okay? For a lot of different situations, I think we can already start to attest to when we use rhetoric. I mean, we as children, we get very skilled, right, at how we appeal to mom and how we appeal to dad, how we appeal to our teacher. We speak differently. We speak in different tones of voice to these people. This is part of it, right? We give different eye contact to them. We have our different body language. So we use this a lot. And sometimes when we use a device, let's call it, kind of very naturally and without thinking, and then we're taught to kind of retrain ourselves to do it in a very different way, or even to become aware of what process we're using, we get very thrown off. Because now it seems very natural to us, we have to kind of break apart, break down, rebuild, and this is what boot camp is, right? Well, this is what learning is. Right? Plato's allegory of the cave is essentially that we believe in shadows. So we have to kind of break down what we do, relearn it, practice it, apply it anew, and then that natural talent and ability will shine through. So this paragraph he writes, rhetoric is useful for number 1, because things that are true and things that are just have a natural tendency to prevail over their opposites. So obviously Aristotle believes that man is good, right? Because he believed that when we hear things that are true and when we hear things that are just, right, as a form of justice, we accept them because we like that. We like things that are good and honest. We know truth when we hear it. So that if the decisions of judges are not what they ought to be, the defeat must be due to the speakers themselves. And so he's saying his rhetoric is so powerful that you can actually persuade someone against the truth if you're poor at rhetoric. You will be able to fail wonderfully if you don't know how to persuade people, because you will persuade them of the opposite, right? So he's saying that if someone is not convinced, it's not because it's not true. It's because you didn't do a good job convincing them. You failed in some way to connect the points for them to see how this is true, because what is true is true. So to the defeat must be due to the speakers themselves, and they must be blamed accordingly, Aristotle writes. And number 2, before some audiences, not even the possession of the exactest knowledge will make it easy for what we say to produce conviction. For argument based on knowledge implies instruction, and there are people whom one cannot instruct. So he says different audiences take a different mode of persuasion. Okay, you will not be speaking to your friends, okay, your group of friends, your core group, about Donald Trump, let's say, the way that you would speak to me about Donald Trump, or maybe even the way you speak to your parents or a stranger on the street, right? Everyone is educated differently. Everyone has a different perspective. And so he's saying, even if you just display facts, sometimes that's not enough, okay? Because sometimes people don't care about facts, or they don't know about facts. They don't trust your facts, right? Here then we must use as our modes of persuasion and argument notions possessed by everybody, as we observed in the topics with dealing with how to handle a popular audience, right? And so that's more appeals to emotion, to things that we find common in each other, regardless of education or territory. Further, 3, we must be able to employ persuasion. Okay, we have to be able to use persuasion, just as strict reasoning can be employed. Just as we try to reason things through, we also have to try to persuade very purposely on opposite sides of a question, not in order that we may in practice employ it in both ways, but in order that we may see clearly what the facts are, and that if another man argues unfairly, we on our part are able to confute him. And this is what every lawyer does very well, right? You have to be able to see both sides of every argument. For a couple reasons. Number 1, don't you want to understand all perspectives before you open your mouth? I think that's super important, because people who are talking are not listening, and you don't know everything. And sometimes you don't know anything, okay, depending on the topic. So you have to be able to argue both sides. And this is why when you see people in strategy meetings, or you see lawyers preparing for court, or you even see yourself debating, don't you make a pros and cons list? Right? Don't you play devil's advocate with yourself or with your friends and say, oh, I see your perspective, but what if this was also true, right? What if this happened? And then you kind of bring in another thing, bring in the other side of the argument. And what you're doing there is, number 1, you're getting at the dialectic, right? You're getting to the truth. Number 2, if somebody, once you get to the truth and you're up against someone who's trying to, you're persuading, and they say, no, I think this, what about this? You've already thought about that. You've already planned ahead. You already know what to say. You're like, yeah, I understand that you think that, but let me tell you why you're wrong. And there's not even a bump there. There's not even a pause, because you're ready. And that is, in my opinion, a huge part of the dialectic. That's part of the process of getting to the truth. And that's something we take into rhetoric when we persuade of the truth. No other of the arts draws opposite conclusions. Dialectic and rhetoric alone do this. That's exactly what I'm saying, right? Both these arts draw opposite conclusions impartially. This is super important. This is why we can't talk lately about anything as a culture, because nobody is impartial. Everybody is so vested. You have to, and we read this in education, right? John Henry Newman told us, dispassionate mind. You have to go into things and see them as concepts, see them as ideas. You can't have road rage about every event, every idea, everything someone says. You have to think clearly. You are not vested in everything, okay? And even if you are, you have to pull back. You have to see all sides, because things change, okay? What you once thought was true may not be true anymore. And you will need both a dialectic and a rhetoric in your life. You use them already. You already do. He's just making us aware of how this functions in our process that we use naturally. 4, it is absurd to hold that a man ought to be ashamed of being unable to defend himself with his limbs, but not of being unable to defend himself with speech and reason, when the use of rational speech is more distinctive of a human being than the use of his limbs. And here he's talking about the differentiation of us as a species on this earth, right? Every animal, every other creature needs to fight for survival. They need to kill to eat, okay? We don't, okay? We don't have to fight for survival every day. We don't have to hunt our own food. We have distinguished ourselves as a species. We also have something else. We have language. Not only that, but we have over 270 languages, Okay, so he's saying, how do we just first jump to defending ourselves like beasts with our limbs and our fists, right? Kicking and screaming and punching. But we are so much more adept and in fact have evolved into the species that convinces with the mouth, with reason, with logic, with words, with language, right? Which is what this whole module is about, language and the power of instruction, persuasion. It just distinguishes us as a species on earth, and it is diplomacy, right? It is what we yearn for. It is what we strive for, because what he's literally talking about here is the difference between diplomacy and war. Okay? War is us fighting for survival with our limbs. And now we use technology, now we use drones, tanks, guns, whatever. It's still an extension of us, okay? On the other hand, we have diplomacy, where we sit down, and even when we hate each other, even when we don't understand each other, and even when we fear each other, it is our duty to use the evolution or God-given talents of our mouth and our speech to convince each other, to avoid struggle, to avoid conflict, and to avoid battle. Let's go down to the bottom of 188. It is clear then that rhetoric is not bound up with a single definite class of subjects, but it is as universal as dialectic. It is clear also that it is useful. It is clear further that it functions not simply in succeeding in persuading, but rather to discover the means of coming as near such success as the circumstances of each particular case can allow. So rhetoric is not just you being able to convince somebody of something and feeling like, oh, I got it. No, rhetoric is you basically living your life as rhetoric, right? What I believe, I live, okay? With not just my words, but my whole life, okay? And so he's saying rhetoric is part of that. It's a part of the way that you live your life, even when you're not trying to convince somebody. For example, it is not the function of medicine simply to make a man quite healthy, but to put him as far as may be on the road to health. It is possible to give excellent treatment even to those who can never enjoy sound health. Furthermore, it is plain that it is the function of one and the same art to discern the real and apparent means of persuasion, just as it is the function of the dialectic to discern the real and the apparent syllogism. Okay? The difference between what appears real and what appears not real. And we're talking appearances, right? Apparent is a very important word, apparent. We the older you get, you realize not judging a book by its cover, appearances are not always what they are. Sometimes something looks true. Sometimes something looks good, it looks right, and it's wrong, and it's false, and it's a lie. Okay? So it's giving you the ability to discern between what Plato calls the world of shadows and the world of truth, right? That's exactly what we're trying to do as scholars and as students, is say, I have these certain beliefs that I was raised in, that I experienced, that I have acquired, and now I want to go out and see if it's true. I want to go out and know that this is how the rest of my life should be lived. And when we come to things that are butting up against that, that's a good thing. That means that we're actually encountering education, okay? Let's jump to section 2, paragraph 10. Rhetoric may be defined as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. What he's saying here is like a thief who goes into any jewelry store and is immediately casing it. Okay, should be us. We go into any situation and we look for the opportunities to find something that makes sense to us, and we can use it in an argument. For example, I teach all of this stuff, like these ancient texts and antiquities. I teach the present philosophies, all that stuff, right? And when I'm watching the news and when I'm reading the paper, I see examples of this stuff that I'm teaching in real time, okay, happening now, not 2,000, 4,000 years ago, like some of the stuff I'm teaching, but now, and I say, that's it, Erica, bring it into class. This is another tool for your persuasion to show them, see, I see it here too. Don't you see it here too? Right? You're looking for the opportunity, making connections, saying, wow, that reminds me of this. Look at that. That is just like what we talked about in class. And keeping it and bringing it in with you. And it becomes part of your knowledge, right? And then being able to use it, firing it at will. At the bottom of that paragraph says, but rhetoric we look upon as the power of observing the means of persuasion on almost any subject presented to us. That is why we say that, and its technical character is not concerned with any special or definite class of subjects. Rhetoric is used in the courtroom. It is used in romance. It is used in parenting. It is used in serving food. On the menu. It has to convince you that the meal that you're about to get, which you can't see or smell yet, is going to be delicious, right? We use rhetoric in everything: science, art, technology, personal relationships. So he's saying this is really not ascribed to one discipline. This is for everything. And we know that, right? Because if rhetoric is the ability to teach things, right? Everything has to be taught. Every single discipline, every category of everything on earth has a truth, okay? Has a truth and has a lie. And it's our job to find it. Of the modes of persuasion, some belong strictly to the art of rhetoric, and some do not. By the latter, I mean such things are not supplied by the speaker, but they are at the outset: witnesses, evidence given under torture, written contracts, and so on. By the former, I mean we can ourselves construct by means of the principles of rhetoric. So he's saying some things you can't change. Facts you can't change. Witness testimony you can't change. Day and night you can't change, okay? But there are other parts of it that you can change, and both of those are rhetoric, okay? Both the fixed and the variable. Those are both rhetoric. The one kind has merely to be used, the other has to be invented. Right, facts I could just use. Here, put it on the PowerPoint, boom. Put it on the board, boom. Say it on Twitter, boom. There's your fact. I just have to use it. And the other things I have to invent. The other thing I have to build. I have to create an argument. I have to show you examples. I have to use my language to guide you to the truth, right? Like the yellow brick road. Of the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, there are three kinds. The first depends on the personal character of the speaker. All right, we care about who we hear stuff from, okay? You trust people more when you trust them already, and they don't have to make as part of their argument, hey guys, trust me, right? If you trust people at the outset, if they have a good character, you immediately take what they say to heart. This is immediately like our parents, right? We trust our parents love us. We trust our parents are experienced, are educated, don't want to lead us astray. So when dad or mom give us advice, or a wise elder gives us advice, we're like, you know what? He knows what he's talking about. That he didn't have to do that much more work because he's already a trusted speaker to you, right? That's the first. The second is putting the audience into a certain frame of mind, which is what I talked about in the beginning. Getting you prepared to hear my lecture, getting you prepared to hear my speech, getting you ready to hear the joke so that you're ready to laugh, right? I'm putting you in a certain frame of mind. I'm setting you up kind of in a way. Third, proof or apparent proof provided by the words of the speech itself. Now this is super important. Proof is excuse me, is different from facts. He already said facts are something fixed. Okay, proof or apparent proof is furnished by the words of the speaker. It's super important that you hear the difference between that. One is proof, one is apparent proof. So let me say that again. One is the truth, and one looks like the truth. You see the difference? He's saying in rhetoric, it doesn't make a difference. In real life, it makes a difference, but you can convince people of lies because you sell it as truth. You can convince people this is true even though it just looks true, but it's not true really, okay? So he's saying for rhetoric, you don't really need the truth all the time. You need apparent truth, apparent proof, okay? This is obviously not the ideal. We want to teach truth all the time, but he's just giving you a tool to, realize that people are convinced of everything, right? So if your job is to convince or to persuade, and he's being honest about the art itself, especially if he's telling you have to be able to argue both sides. Well, one lawyer's arguing that my client's guilty. One is arguing that he's not guilty. Both can't be true, right? But one could be successful more than the other to convince you of what is true. Do you see the difference? Persuasion is achieved by the speaker's personal character when the speech is so spoken as to make us think he's credible, right? That's what I was saying. When someone's credible, we immediately say, hey, he's a good guy. I trust him. He's given me good advice before. Or he's a teacher. He knows what he's doing. He's a doctor. I'll take his advice because why am I going to take medical advice from my mechanic, but I'll take it from my doctor, right? Because that's credible. We believe good men more fully and more readily than others. Let's turn to page 182. We're almost done. His character may almost be called the most effective means of persuasion he possesses. And that's super important to know, right? Sometimes when we label someone as something, it's very hard for them to shake off that label because that becomes true. All right, so same thing goes for bad reputation and good reputation. When someone has a good reputation, even if there's a rumor about him that's wrong, you don't want to believe it because you're like, no, he's got a good reputation. And the other times too, it's like because someone has a bad reputation, you won't believe him even if he's shouting from the rooftops the very real truth of life. So he's saying our character is pretty much the best tool we have, because when you walk into a room where people are going to say, I'm going to listen to her, or they're going to say, I don't care what she has to say. She never says anything good. You know what I'm saying? Even if you had the truth. It's like that story, the boy who cried wolf, right? Even when the wolf came, nobody believed him anymore because he had no credibility. Secondly, persuasion may come through the hearers when the speech stirs their emotions. And what he's saying by the persuasion may come through the hearers is now you have sold people who are now selling for you. Word of mouth. If I touch you in such a way that you go and you tell somebody what I've taught you, now my speech is coming through your mouth. It is coming through the hearer to the person behind him that he's going to share it with, right? So that kind of persuasion is super amazing, right? I mean, what the best advertising is word of mouth. If I tell you I'm getting a great manicure here, or I have a great facial here, or I bought a car here, or this person is great, this doctor is amazing, she cured me, right? I mean, that's going to sell you because it's going to stir your emotions and you're going to tell other people about it. Our judgments when we are pleased and friendly are not the same as when we are pained and hostile. Right? Thirdly, persuasion is affected through the speech itself when we have proved a truth or an apparent truth, again, he's reiterating, by means of the persuasive argument suitable to the case in question. Again, you have to know who you're pitching, okay? One person, small group of people, big group of people, whole country, whole stadium, right? There's a difference, right? The coach talks differently to one player on the field than he talks to the whole team before they go out on the field. Okay, the coach knows the difference. He's doing rhetoric all the time. Okay, so that's what he's talking about. Last paragraph. 3 means of effecting persuasion. The man who is to be in command of them must, it is clear, be able to 1, reason logically. You have to be able to be a reasonable person. Henry Newman taught us this. Shin Tzu taught us this. You have to be able to be a reasonable person. Nobody wants to talk to someone who's shouting all the time, who's threatening violence, who's very noisy, who's very messy, who's chaotic, who's absurd, who's too jokey, right? You have to be able to reason. The person has to say, you know what? I don't agree with that person, but he's a reasonable person, right? And that's powerful, especially in this day and age. 2, to understand human character and goodness in their various forms. You have to know people. And these are the people who have natural talent, like they're a people person, right? They can go anywhere and they know how to strike a conversation with anybody, know how to talk to this person, I'll talk differently to that guy, know how to talk to business guy than I would my mechanic, than I would my mom friend, right? Human character. You have to kind of know what you're appealing to in the group. You may have a group that's hostile against your argument. And you may have a group that's already on your side. So you have to deal with those very differently. 3, to understand the emotions. And listen, to name them, to describe them, to know their causes and the way in which they are excited. If I had a board behind me, I'd be writing all of this stuff on the board, right? To name them. This is something we teach children, right? Use your words. Don't hit. Say, I'm angry. I'm hurt, right? You have to know what you feel. Describe how you feel. Know the cause of how you feel and the way that you're triggered or excited to feel this way. Now, if you know that about yourself, you also can turn that onto other people and you can find their emotions. You can just name them, describe them, know their causes and the way in which they are triggered. That's very powerful stuff. I mean, you take an argument from 10 to 2 just by knowing, like I told you, right? The source of the anger is the pain. If you're in an argument with somebody, they're not just angry, they're hurt. Get to the source of the pain, right? It thus appears that rhetoric is an offshoot of dialectic and also of ethical studies. Ethical studies may fairly be called political. Now, this is super important. Why would he bring ethics into this? What are ethics? They're different from morals, right? Morals are like a code that we live by, some religious, some not religious. Ethics are a way that we conduct society. Everybody is held to ethics, right? When you go to law school, you take an ethics class. When you go to business school, you take an ethics class. There's ethics at your job, right? You can't be like a really terrible electrician and screw people over all day, right? There's ethics that we hold to. Don't lie to the teacher. Don't cheat on a test. Right? Don't forge a paper and turn it in as your own. There's ethics we hold to. Now, why would he bring up ethics for rhetoric? Because when you have a skill of persuasion, you better be careful how you use it. Just like any other tool. And if this is the most powerful tool we have, which is what Aristotle is saying, because it differentiates us as a species on this earth. When you know how to convince somebody, you be careful how you do it. And be careful of people convincing you. Because just because they're good, smooth talkers, right? They could charm the pants right off of you. They could charm the money out of your bank account. There are people who are persuasive and they're bad. He's warning two things. Number one, don't be like that, okay? Don't use your power for evil, okay? Use your power for good. And number two, be wary of others who have this power, okay? Don't just be in awe like, I'm just going to listen to everything you say and do whatever you say. No, question, doubt. Be careful, okay? Because persuasion is powerful. And just like he's saying that we can convince people of apparent truth, something that looks true, even though it's not, we too can be convinced of lies. Just because they're sold to us as truth. So with that, he finishes this. And I think that's a very powerful way to finish it because it is kind of this warning, right? And it's also kind of a success because he's saying you will achieve this, you will get this, this can be learned. And once you learn it and you're successful in it, be careful. Be good with it. Just like any talent we have that we possess, we should be honorable about it and humbled by it, right? And teach others how to have it. So that is Aristotle's Rhetoric. Thank you.